It all started on a quiet suburban street, the kind that prided itself on manicured lawns, evenly spaced mailboxes, and HOA newsletters about community spirit. The kind of place where every blade of grass seemed to have a reputation to maintain. When Daniel moved in with his golden retriever, Max, he thought he'd found the perfect place to settle. Wide sidewalks for morning walks, friendly neighbors waving from their porches. It all seemed ideal. For the first few weeks, life was peaceful. Max had adjusted well to the new home, spending his afternoons chasing tennis balls and napping on the porch. But every story like this has a turning point. For Daniel, it came in the form of a letter. Not a warm welcome card, not a friendly note from the HOA, but a formal complaint. It was written in tidy, angry handwriting, signed simply, Karen, Lot 24. The note claimed that Max's barking was disturbing the neighborhood's serenity and causing unnecessary emotional distress. Daniel was confused. Max wasn't an aggressive dog. He barked when the mailman came or when a squirrel ran along the fence. Normal dog stuff. Still, Daniel brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Then came the second letter, and the third, each one more dramatic than the last, filled with accusations and thinly veiled threats of HOA involvement. Karen had apparently decided Max was a menace to society. She claimed his barking echoed through her windows, disrupted her meditation routine, and even frightened her cat. Daniel tried to reason with himself. Maybe she was just sensitive to noise. Maybe she lived a quiet life and Max's energy was too much. He started taking extra steps, longer walks, earlier mornings, more playtime at the park. Anything to keep Max calm. But no matter what he did, the complaints kept coming. One day, Daniel caught sight of her, the infamous Karen of Lot 24. She was everything the stereotype promised. Sharp haircut, oversized sunglasses, and an expression that permanently hovered between disapproval and disgust. She was standing at the end of her driveway, glaring at Max like he'd personally committed a war crime. When Daniel waved politely, she turned and stormed inside. Within a week, the HOA got involved. A notice arrived in Daniel's mailbox, stating that multiple noise complaints had been filed against his property. The HOA demanded that he address the issue or face fines. Daniel couldn't believe it. He'd lived there less than 3 months, and already the neighborhood peacekeepers were on his case. He wrote back explaining the situation, noting that Max wasn't a chronic barker, and even offered to install a noise monitor. The HOA's response was cold and indifferent. Compliance is expected. That night, Daniel sat on his porch, watching Max sleep at his feet. The dog let out a soft snore, completely unaware of the chaos his simple barks had caused. Daniel felt a twinge of frustration. He'd moved here for peace, not for petty neighborhood politics. Yet somehow, he'd become the villain in someone else's story. The next morning, he decided to confront the issue head-on. He left a polite note in Karen's mailbox, assuring her he was taking steps to minimize Max's barking. He hoped for a neighborly understanding, a handshake, maybe even a truce. But the following day, his note was returned, torn in half, with a new complaint taped to it. "This is harassment. Keep your animal under control." That was the moment something in Daniel shifted. The irritation that had been simmering finally started to boil. If Karen wanted to play games, he decided, maybe it was time she got a taste of her own medicine. But he wasn't going to stoop to yelling matches or angry letters. No, Daniel had a better idea. One that would teach her a lesson without crossing the line. That night, while scrolling through his phone, Daniel stumbled upon an online forum filled with stories of HOA disputes and petty revenge. He read for hours, fascinated by how creative people could get when pushed by unreasonable neighbors. One particular post caught his attention, a story about a man who taught his parrot to mimic his neighbor's complaints. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. Daniel looked down at Max, who was lying beside him, tail wagging lazily. A spark of inspiration hit him. What if he could turn Max's barking, the very thing Karen hated, into something he controlled? What if he could make her realize how absurd her complaints had been, one bark at a time? Over the next few days, Daniel began to train Max with new commands. "Speak. he'd say, rewarding Max when he barked. Quiet, he'd say, rewarding silence. It didn't take long for Max to catch on. He was a smart dog, eager to please. Soon, Daniel could make Max bark on command, stop instantly, and even give a few short barks in sequence. For a while, it was just a funny trick. But then came the perfect opportunity. One afternoon, Daniel noticed Karen standing outside again, phone in hand, glaring toward his yard. She was probably recording, hoping to catch evidence for another complaint. Daniel smiled, knelt beside Max, and whispered, "Speak." Max barked. Once, twice, 3 times. Loud, proud, and on command. Karen froze, glaring in disbelief. Daniel leaned back in his chair, calm and casual, like nothing had happened. A few seconds later, he gave the quiet command, and Max went silent. It was flawless. Karen stormed inside, slamming her door. 10 minutes later, Daniel got an email from the HOA, forwarding yet another complaint. But this time he couldn't help but laugh, because now he wasn't the victim of Karen's obsession. He was in control of it. In the days that followed, Daniel perfected the routine. Every time Karen stepped outside, he'd quietly give Max the speak command. Every time she glared or muttered something under her breath, he'd have Max bark again. It was petty, yes, but strangely satisfying. Karen was fuming, and Daniel was finally enjoying a bit of harmless fun. But then, something unexpected happened. One morning, Daniel noticed Karen setting up what looked like a camera on her window. A small tripod pointed directly at his yard. She was clearly recording now, gathering evidence. The HOA would surely get another letter soon, this time backed by video. Daniel knew the battle was escalating. His harmless joke had turned into a full-blown neighborhood standoff. And as he watched Karen pacing by her window, notebook in hand, he realized she wasn't going to stop. What Daniel didn't know was that Karen had already taken her complaints to the next level. And soon, this quiet street was about to become the stage for a feud no one in the neighborhood would forget. The week following Karen's camera setup marked the official start of what neighbors would later refer to as the barking war. What had begun as a petty feud between 2 people was about to spiral into something much larger. Something that would divide the neighborhood and make the HOA meetings far more entertaining than they'd ever been before. Karen's obsession had reached new heights. She began keeping a detailed barking log, recording the time, duration, and perceived volume of every bark she claimed to hear. Neighbors sometimes spotted her standing near her window with a notepad, glaring toward Daniel's yard as if she were tracking enemy movements. Her blinds barely moved, yet everyone knew she was always watching. Meanwhile, Daniel tried to go about his days as normally as possible. He worked remotely, took Max on regular walks, and tried to maintain a peaceful routine. But it was clear the situation was escalating. Within a week, he received another email from the HOA, this one more formal and threatening. They warned him that further disturbances could result in fines or even legal action. Attached was a video file that Karen had submitted as proof. Daniel watched it, shaking his head. The video showed Max barking twice on command before going silent again. The audio captured Karen's exaggerated narration in the background, claiming the noise was constant and unbearable. Even worse, she had apparently edited the clip to loop the barking sounds, making it seem like Max barked nonstop. It was ridiculous, but the HOA didn't seem to notice that moment. Daniel realized he couldn't win by playing nice anymore. Logic didn't work with Karen, and the HOA wasn't interested in fairness. If they wanted to believe her lies, then maybe it was time to give them a real show. He began carefully crafting his plan. The goal wasn't to harm anyone or even truly disturb the neighborhood. It was to expose Karen's obsession and make her behavior so outrageous that even the HOA couldn't ignore it. With Max's training complete, Daniel had all the tools he needed. He began by observing Karen's habits. She was a creature of routine. Morning coffee on the porch, afternoon gardening, and evening walks with her cat in a stroller. It wasn't hard to predict when she'd be outside. Every time she stepped out, Daniel would give Max the speak command. 1 bark, sometimes 2, just enough to catch her attention. Then silence. Karen would freeze, scowl, and storm inside. Minutes later, she'd reappear with her phone, trying to record evidence. Each time, Daniel would wait for her to start filming before giving Max another single bark. The timing was impeccable, almost comedic. To anyone watching, it looked like Max was deliberately mocking her. Word spread quickly. Neighbors began to notice the pattern and couldn't help but laugh. Some even recorded their own clips of the encounters, posting them anonymously online. Within days, the video titled "Dog Outsmarts Crazy Neighbor" began circulating in local community groups, racking up thousands of views. Karen's attempts to play the victim were backfiring spectacularly. But Karen wasn't one to back down. If anything, the viral attention made her more determined. She filed an official noise complaint with the city and started organizing a small group of like-minded residents to preserve neighborhood peace. It was clear she believed she was leading some kind of crusade. Daniel, meanwhile, decided to escalate just enough to keep her off balance. He began experimenting with timing, having Max bark during Karen's Zoom calls, which she loudly conducted on her porch, or right when she started mowing her lawn. It wasn't frequent enough to constitute harassment, but it was timed so perfectly that it drove her crazy. Soon, Karen's retaliations turned strange. She began leaving passive-aggressive notes in Daniel's mailbox, each one signed, "Concerned Neighbor." She complained about his choice of lawn decorations, his trash can placement, even the color of his porch light. Daniel saved every note, documenting everything. He knew this was becoming more than a petty feud. It was evidence of targeted harassment. Then came the breaking point. One afternoon, Daniel returned home to find an official city notice taped to his door. It stated that an anonymous complaint had been filed about his aggressive animal, and that animal control would be conducting an inspection. His stomach sank. Karen had gone that far. When the officer arrived, Max wagged his tail and rolled over for belly rubs. The officer chuckled, clearly unimpressed by the claims. Still, procedure required a brief inspection. By the end, the officer assured Daniel that Max was well-behaved and that the complaint was clearly exaggerated. Daniel thanked him, but deep down, he knew Karen wouldn't stop there. That night, as Daniel sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, he thought about how absurd things had gotten, all because of a dog barking a few times a day. Karen had turned a simple nuisance into a personal crusade, and now the entire neighborhood was caught in the fallout. But something unexpected began happening after that. The same neighbors who once ignored Daniel started stopping by. They shared their own stories of Karen's complaints, everything from overgrown hedges to improperly parked bicycles. It turned out she'd been policing the entire street for years, making enemies of almost everyone. Daniel wasn't her first target, just her latest. Encouraged by their support, Daniel decided to take things a step further. He compiled all the notes, HOA letters, and video clips into one organized file. His plan was simple: to expose Karen's behavior to the HOA board at the next community meeting. But before that day came, something hilarious unfolded one evening. As Daniel was training Max in the yard, Karen emerged again, phone in hand, ready to catch her evidence. Daniel gave Max the speak command, and Max let out a few short barks. What Daniel didn't expect was for other neighborhood dogs to join in. One after another, barks echoed up and down the street. Within seconds, the entire block was alive with barking. A symphony of canine rebellion. Karen panicked, shouting from her porch, waving her arms in frustration. Her voice was drowned out completely by the chorus of barking dogs. Lights turned on in houses up and down the street. People peeked through curtains, laughing quietly as they watched the chaos unfold. That IT was poetic. The very sound Karen had tried to silence was now everywhere, and there was nothing she could do about it. By the time the barking subsided, Karen was furious. She stormed inside, slamming her door so hard it echoed. Daniel couldn't help but smile. He hadn't planned that. It was pure coincidence, but it felt like karma itself had stepped in. Still, he knew this wasn't over. The next HOA meeting was only a few days away, and Karen would undoubtedly show up with her evidence. But this time, Daniel would be ready. Not just with proof, but with the support of the entire neighborhood. As he turned off the porch light that night, Daniel glanced down at Max, who wagged his tail as if he understood every bit of the chaos he'd caused. The war wasn't over yet, but for the first time, Daniel felt like he wasn't fighting it alone. The day of the HOA meeting arrived like the calm before a storm. The community hall, usually reserved for bake sales and gardening club discussions, buzzed with tension. Residents shuffled in, whispering about the feud that had consumed their quiet neighborhood. It had become impossible to ignore. The story of the barking war had reached everyone. Some came out of curiosity, others out of amusement. And at the center of it all sat Daniel, calm and composed, with a folder full of evidence resting on his lap. Karen arrived 10 minutes late, as if to make an entrance. She wore a sharp beige blazer and carried a stack of papers so thick it looked like a legal case file. Her lips were pursed tight, her expression radiating triumph. She was here to end it, or so she thought. When the meeting began, the HOA president, a tired-looking man who had clearly had enough of neighborhood drama, started reading the agenda. After a few routine matters about lawn maintenance and street repairs, he sighed and announced, "Next item, noise complaints, Lot 27 versus Lot 24. The room went silent. Everyone turned their eyes toward Daniel and Karen. Karen was the first to speak, her voice sharp and self-righteous. She declared that she had endured months of harassment from Daniel's viciously loud animal. She presented her edited videos, her barking log, and her collection of complaint letters. Each time she placed another document on the table, she shot Daniel a smug glance, certain she had already won. But then, as the board members reviewed her evidence, a quiet chuckle rose from one corner of the room. It was one of the neighbors, the same one who had posted the viral video online. The HOA president looked up, confused. "Is something funny?" he asked. The neighbor simply said, "You might want to see this before you make any decisions." He pulled out his phone and played the clip, "Dog outsmarts crazy neighbor." The room erupted with laughter. On the screen, Max barked obediently on command, pausing perfectly each time Daniel gave a signal. Karen's voice could be heard in the background, ranting about constant barking, even as the video clearly showed otherwise. Her exaggerated gestures and angry muttering turned what she thought was evidence into comedy. Karen's face turned red, her confidence crumbling. She demanded the video be turned off, claiming it was defamatory. But no one was listening. Even the HOA president had to stifle a laugh. The mood in the room shifted completely, from tension to amusement. Daniel stood up, calm and steady. He placed his folder on the table and began explaining everything. How he had trained Max to bark on command, how Karen had edited her videos to loop the sound, how she had filed false reports with the HOA and even with the city. He showed the torn notes, the timestamps, and the animal control report that had cleared Max of any wrongdoing. His evidence was clear, factual, and devastating. The room fell silent again as Daniel finished speaking. Then, one by one, neighbors began nodding. Several raised their hands to share their own experiences. Stories of Karen complaining about harmless things. Kids playing too loudly, holiday decorations being too bright, or someone's grass being too long. It became clear that Karen wasn't a victim. She was a chronic complainer who had made life difficult for nearly everyone. By the time the last neighbor finished speaking, the HOA board had heard enough. The president leaned forward, his tone firm but exhausted. He announced that Karen's complaints would be dismissed and that any future grievances from her would require verified third-party evidence before being considered. Then, with a faint smirk, he added that harassment of other residents would result in disciplinary action, including fines or suspension of HOA privileges. The room broke into quiet applause. For the first time in months, the community stood united, not against a barking dog, but against the person who had made their neighborhood miserable. Karen sat frozen, her face pale and her papers scattered across the table. She tried to protest, insisting she was the victim, but her words fell flat. The board moved on to the next agenda item, and she was left sitting there, powerless. When the meeting ended, she stormed out without a word, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Daniel lingered for a while, chatting with neighbors who were eager to shake his hand. The tension that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by laughter and relief. Even the HOA president, once so stern, gave Daniel a small nod of approval. Over the next few weeks, things finally began to calm down. Karen kept to herself, rarely seen outside except for short trips to her mailbox. Her blinds stayed closed, and her once loud voice had vanished from community spaces. Some said she was embarrassed. Others believed she was simply waiting for the storm to pass. Either way, the peace that had been missing from the neighborhood slowly returned. Daniel, on the other hand, found himself becoming something of a local hero. The viral video continued to circulate, gaining millions of views under new titles like Petty Revenge Done Right and Dog vs. Karen. Who won? Strangers online praised him for his patience, creativity, and calm execution. He even received a few offers from local dog trainers asking if he'd like to collaborate. As for Max, life couldn't have been better. He became the unofficial mascot of the neighborhood. Every kid wanted to pet him, and neighbors often brought treats during walks. Daniel even hung a small sign on his front gate that read, "Beware of dog, especially if you're a Karen." It became a running joke, a reminder of how absurd things had once been. Months later, a small envelope appeared in Daniel's mailbox. No name, no return address, just a single note inside. It read, "I shouldn't have taken it so far. I was wrong." It wasn't signed, but Daniel didn't need a signature to know who it was from. For a long moment, he stood on his porch, looking out over the peaceful street. Max sat beside him, tail wagging, head tilted as if waiting for a command. Daniel smiled, patted Max's head, and whispered, "Quiet." The dog settled down instantly, curling at his feet. The battle was over, and for the first time since moving in, Daniel finally felt at home. From that day on, peace truly returned to the neighborhood. Not because the HOA enforced it, but because one stubborn man and his loyal dog had taught everyone a lesson in patience, humor, and the art of fighting back with kindness. And somewhere, behind closed blinds, even Karen couldn't help but smile when she heard a single, gentle bark echo across the street. A reminder of the feud that had humbled her, one wagging tail at a time.